Our speaker tonight is J. Anthony Lucas. Tony Lucas was educated at Harvard and the Free University in Berlin, Germany. He contributes to magazines ranging from the Atlantic and Harper's to the Washington Post, Book World, and Playboy. He's winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the first awarded him in 1968 for special local reporting in connection with his coverage of the Chicago 7 conspiracy trial for the New York Times, which later became a book entitled The Barnyard Epithet and Other Obscenities, Notes on the Chicago Conspiracy Trial. His second Pulitzer Prize came in 1986 for general nonfiction for his book on Boston busing, Common Ground, A Turbulent Decade in the Lives of 3 American Families. He also is author of The Underside of the Nixon Years, which produced quite a book, as you might imagine. Tony lives in New York City, but he comes most recently from Helena, where he has been researching on various things, including the socialist newspaper woman Ida Crouch Hazlitt. His book that he's working on now is on the Big Bill Haywood trial, which grew up generally out of the labor strife in the Coeur d'Alene district of Idaho at the turn of the century, and specifically out of the assassination of former Idaho Governor Frank Stunenberg. I picked Tony up at the airport this afternoon, and I asked why a man with 2 Pulitzer Prizes for work on the Chicago 7 trial and Boston busing would take on a topic like the Big Bill Haywood trial and Western labor strife in the Rocky Mountain West. Tony said he became interested in the topic about 2 years ago, and he said he was looking for a story with gumshoe detectives, unethical newspapermen, vamps, and other assorted sleazy characters. I thought to myself, well, I'm glad he found it in Idaho. Certainly there was never anything like that similar in Montana. Fortunately, Tony's plane came in about 3 or 3:30. He didn't get here till 4, well past the session on Montana's jerks. Without further ado, I present to you a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a fine historian and journalist, and a very likable man, Tony Lucas.
Thank you, Chuck. No dinner speech is complete without an opening anecdote, and it was provided for me on my plane trip from Salt Lake City to Helena. I don't know whether you've ever heard an entire 747 jet erupt in laughter, but I did when the embarrassed young stewardess said that she wanted to welcome 210 people on their flight to Helena. The woman next to me said, "Can you believe it?" I had a feeling that Delta had lost several clients, but I have learned my pronunciation, and I've had a splendid time for 2 days in your remarkable library at Helena, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. Some of you may know a passage from Ross Lockridge's novel Raintree County, in which John Wycliffe Shaughnessy and Professor Jerusalem Webster Stiles are reading through a copy of the Indianapolis News Historian for July 4th, 1892, in which is recounted the most recent pontification of Garwood P. Jones, the senior senator from Indiana, about the forces of anarchy abroad in the land. "Meanwhile," Mr. Shaughnessy said, "the real world goes on, the world of the only possible fact." "What is this fact?" asked the professor. "A human life," said Shaughnessy. "That's the only thing that ever happens, whereas the news historian, like history, deals with something called the event." "What is this event?" the professor asked cooperatively. "The event is something that never happened," Shaughnessy went on. "It's a convenient myth abstracted from the welter of human fact. Events happen only in the newspapers and history books. But life goes on, being one human being at a time who is trying to find that mythical republic in which he can live with honor and happiness. Just so, the professor said, and thus the republic's a lie, and history's a lie, and the newspaper's a great lie. Well, in this company of so many distinguished historians, I would not go quite that far. But I would argue that, as Shaughnessy and the professor have hinted, history and journalism have similar perplexing and largely unsolved problems in making their selection from the welter of human fact. But fact is not enough, I think. I'm reminded of an incident which took place during the Chicago conspiracy trial, aforementioned, which I covered for the New York Times in 1969-70. Among the witnesses summoned by the defense was one Norman Mailer. From the start of his testimony, it was clear that Mailer came back to Chicago that day to exorcise a nagging sense of guilt about his own role during the convention in Chicago. On the bandstand in Grant Park on the day of the celebrated police riot, he had told the crowd that he couldn't take part in their demonstration because he had a magazine deadline to meet and couldn't risk getting arrested. The radicals didn't buy that, and some even suggested that the champ was frightened. Ever sensitive about slights to his manhood, Mailer sensitive about slights to his manhood, Mailer had brooded about the charge ever since, and on the witness stand, he tried to grapple honestly with his own emotions. I was in a moral quandary, he said. I didn't know if I was being scared or being professional. And I was naturally quite upset because a man never likes to know that his motive might be simple fear. But Judge Julius Hoffman was impatient with all this motivational probing. We're simple folks here, he snapped. Just tell us what you said. And he said. Finally, as Mailer continued to search out the delicate shadings of meaning in the streets of Chicago, Assistant U.S. Attorney Dick Schultz leapt to his feet and told him to stick to the facts. Mailer fixed the young lawyer with a dyspeptic eye and said, "Facts are nothing without their nuance, sir." That line stuck in my head, and a few years later, when I left the Times to write books for a living, I had decided that the principal reason was there just wasn't much space for nuance in a daily newspaper. That isn't really the newspaper's fault. Most of daily journalism is produced at breakneck speed for rather small news holes, with the emphasis on communicating the maximum information in brief compass. When the copy editor's red pencil begins to flash, the first things to go are the reporter's stabs at nuance. And one shouldn't blame the editors too much. One must concede that most reporters aren't terribly good at the nuance game themselves. During my term as the Times correspondent in India, I covered a burst of Hindu fundamentalist agitation over the cow slaughter issue. As you will recall, Hindus regard the cow as a protected creature. If not quite sacred, then certainly an animal imbued with special grace and power. It goes without saying that to eat beef is a terrible crime against the faith. Muslims don't see it that way, and occasionally violence will break out in a North Indian province when Muslims slaughter a cow. In the spring of 1966, nearly a dozen Muslims were killed in Uttar Pradesh over the cow slaughter issue. As an old customer at Frankie and Johnny's renowned speakeasy and steakhouse on 46th Street, it was difficult for me to empathize with the Hindus on this one. I tried. I wrote 6 stories about the cow slaughter issue, struggling to understand why Hindus were willing to take human life in order to protect bovine life. Try as I might, I couldn't quite understand. And late one night, as I pounded out a piece for the News of the Week in Review, I thought to myself, after 5 years in the Congo and India, I'm ready to go home, where I can capture the cadence of the people I'm writing about, not just the facts. It was the search for cadence, the search for nuance, which led to my departure from the New York Times in 1973. For the past 17 years, I've been a freelance journalist writing articles and books. A big chunk of that time was spent on my last book, Common Ground, in which I sought to capture the cadences of 3 different families, one Irish, one black, and one Yankee, as they collided over issues of race and class in Boston. The effort to cross the boundaries of race and class, to understand what it must have been like growing up in somebody else's shoes, is, I think, one of the writer's principal tasks. The novelist Ed Doctorow has said that one thing the writer does is to distribute the sorrow. That is to say, by making us feel the sorrow of those he or she writes about, to allow us to pick up at least part of the sorrow borne by one's characters. Doctorow is clearly talking about the novelist more than the writer of nonfiction, but I like that notion of distributing the sorrow, and I think, without realizing it, was one of the things I was trying to do in Common Ground. But race and class and geography are not the only gulfs which divide us. L.P. Hartley, the British novelist, has said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." If it was difficult for me to comprehend the Hindu's rage at cow slaughter, it is difficult for any of us to comprehend life as it was led 50 years ago, much less 100 or 200 years ago. In Common Ground, I began to gnaw at that boundary by tracing each of the three families back to the 18th century. Indeed, I became obsessed by the historical roots of the Boston tragedy because I was convinced that we all trail around with us three strands of history: our personal history, our family history, and what, for lack of a better name, I would call our tribal history. To me, much of Common Ground was about the burden of history. One needn't subscribe to predestination to believe that we are all nudged along by these three strands of history. Not surprisingly, then, when the time came to choose the subject for my next book, I decided to attempt for the first time a full-blown work of history. The subject I chose, as Chuck has mentioned, are the events surrounding the assassination of the one-time governor of Idaho, Frank Stunenberg, in 1905. Back where I come from in the East, there would be at this point a collective shrug of incomprehension in the room. Virtually nobody, and this may interest you, virtually nobody I have told about this story east of the Mississippi has ever heard of it. But I assume that out here the Stunenberg saga still has a certain resonance. For the few among you who may not know it, let me just briefly summarize it for you. In late December of 1905, the former governor of Idaho, Frank Stunenberg, returns from an errand downtown in the little town of Caldwell, Idaho, 30 miles south of Boise, and enters his garden gate, at which point a bomb attached to the gate blows him, as the paper the next day said, into eternity. The local authorities immediately throw a cordon around the town and arrest the usual suspects, 7 of the weirdest weirdos you can possibly imagine. And they finally charge one Thomas Hogan, an itinerant sheep dealer, with murdering the governor. At this point enters James McParland, the legendary Pinkerton detective who 30 years before had been responsible for infiltrating the Molly Maguires in the Pennsylvania coalfields, and I think leading to the execution of 12 of them. McParland becomes the principal investigator of the Stunenberg assassination, and about 6 weeks later, extracts from Thomas Hogan one of the most astonishing confessions in American criminal history. That A, he is not Thomas Hogan, he is Harry Orchard, and B, that he has blown up the governor, and C, that you think that's something, he has blown up or otherwise assassinated 26 other people, all at the behest of the single man who James McParland has been targeting for the last decade, namely Big Bill Haywood, the Secretary of the Western Federation of Miners. And this leads ultimately to the trial of Haywood in Boise in the summer of 1907, and what was widely called the trial of the century. The century was only 7 years old by that point. I covered it. When I walked into the office of Judge Julius Hoffman in Chicago in 1970, 70, the first words out of Julius Hoffman's mouth were, "Tell me, Mr. Lucas, do you think this will be the trial of the century?" It seems to be on journalist and judge's mind. Anyway, that's the story. Your own state of Montana plays a curious role in the drama, in this drama. As you know, the Coeur d'Alene region of northern Idaho got to introduce Coeur d'Alene. If Big Bill Haywood was responsible for the assassination of Governor Stunenberg, it was, and this was indeed the theory behind the prosecution, it was because Stunenberg was, because the Western Federation was determined to revenge the events of 1899 in the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho, where the governor had called on federal troops. He couldn't call on the National Guard because they were off fighting the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. So he called on federal troops, turned out to be black troops, the famed 24th Infantry Regiment, and these troops had put down, with rather vigorously, a labor insurrection in the Coeur d'Alene. So, Montana, as you know, has an interesting relationship to the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho, which backs up to Montana's western boundary. A curious kind of symbiosis has developed across that mountainous border. On the one hand, the Western Federation of Miners drew much of its early impetus from Montana, most particularly from Butte, whose vigorous unionists for a long while provided the élan, the organizing experience, and indeed the funding for their colleagues across the border. But these very same Idaho miners also used Montana as a kind of exile land, a northern Elba, for men who they saw as traitors to their calling. In April 1892, 4 non-union men, among them William Pipkin and George Wolfe, were hired as strikebreakers by the Spokane mine magnate A.B. Campbell for his union mine in Burke, a tiny, heavily unionized, heavily Irish mining camp in the famed canyon above Wallace. After a few hours in the mine, the 4 men were dragged before a union meeting in Burke. According to Pipkin, who testified later before an investigating committee, the chairman said, "This meeting has been called for the purpose of ascertaining what these men have come into the country for. They are not representatives of the union, and they have no right to come in and go to work." Pipkin replied, "I'm a free American citizen, and I thought I had a right to work for whom I pleased, and when I pleased, and where I pleased, if my employer and myself could agree." The chairman asked all 4 men whether they were now ready to join the union. The 2 others said they were, but Pipkin and Wolfe staunchly refused. The 200 miners then voted on whether to send them down the canyon to Wallace, a relatively short jaunt downhill, or up the canyon and over the mountains into Montana. An arduous 30-mile hike across the snowfields and rocks, all the more forbidding that day because a storm was approaching. The vote was 220-1 to send them up the canyon. When they asked for food before they set out, again according to William Pipkin, union men said, "No, you," excuse the language, folks, "no, you damn sons of bitches, you go to Montana and you go without anything to eat," adding, "You want to go right on into Montana. If you go back to the Coeur d'Alene, your lives aren't worth a cent." As they began tramping up the canyon, youngsters followed along, banging on coal oil cans which they had hung around their necks with ropes as one would a snare drum, and shouting, again, excuse the language, "You sons of bitches, you whorehouse pimps." Finally, the boys dropped away. Pipkin and Wolfe slogged on. The snow was 2 feet deep, but in places drifted up to 6 to 10 feet. In places they fell through up to their hips. It began to rain, laying a slick of ice across the powdery snow. Dressed just as they'd come out of the mine with no coats or hats, the men were chilled to the bone. Starting at 3 p.m., they reached the summit just after dark. At the halfway house in the divide, they were refused food with the warning, "Men who haven't any better sense than to kick against the miners' union ought not to have anything to eat." Mind you, this tale is all Pipkin's tale, as yet uncorroborated by vigorous journalism. Later, a prospector gave them a biscuit as big as an egg and a little piece of bacon. That was all they had to eat until they reached Thompson Falls, Montana, after nightfall the next day. From there, they went to Boise, where a judge issued injunctions against the Union miners in Burke, prohibiting them from interfering with any men at work in the mines. Many miners were arrested for violating the injunction. Indeed, there is a strong suspicion that A.B. Campbell had sent Pipkin and Wolfe into the Union mine precisely to provoke such an incident and get that injunction. After all, when you think about it, how much ore could 4 non-union men extract from a struck mine? But they could extract a judicial edict, which soon became an important weapon in the mine owners' hands. 7 years later, after the 1899 explosion at the Bunker Hill Mill, Montana played a very different role, serving as a refuge for some of the very same miners who had led the strike against the Burke mine in 1892. According to military reports, several dozen of the most prominent Union leaders fled across those same Cabinet Mountains into Montana in the hours and days after the explosion of the Bunker Hill mine, which was indeed the precipitating event of all of the events in 1899, which ultimately, as I say, led to, according to the prosecution's theory, to Stunenberg's assassination. General Henry Clay Merriam was appointed by President McKinley to lead the military expedition of the Coeur d'Alene, and he ordered Lieutenant Henry G. Lyon of Company D, the 24th Infantry, with 65 enlisted men, the very black troops, by the way, who had gone up San Juan Hill next to the Rough Riders, to Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and if I read the history correctly, were the true heroes of San Juan Hill, but that's another story. Company D was ordered to cross into Montana at the aforementioned Thompson Falls. Lyon was accompanied by 3 Idaho sheriff's deputies. Lyon later insisted that his detachment was never intended to make any arrests or assist in making arrests. The arrests, he said, were to be made strictly by Montana deputies, who would then turn the fugitives over to the Idaho deputies. Lyon later told Congress that his troops were merely there for what he called their moral effect on the people of Montana. His unit's official status, he testified, was, quote, United States troops in the field changing stations, unquote. Under close questioning by the Democrats on the investigating committee, Lyon conceded that his troops accompanied the deputies both on the train and later in Montana, that they were there to support the deputies, and that had there been resistance from the prisoners, they might well have intervened. In fact, the troops played a much larger role than intended, in part because Montana authorities declined to play their anticipated roles. The most flagrant example of this was in Missoula, where the city and county deputies refused to participate in a scheduled raid on a boarding house where suspected fugitives from Idaho were said to be living. At the request of the Idaho deputies, Lyon, 3 non-commissioned officers, and 10 privates went along on this raid. Lyon insisted that they were there purely as spectators, but it appears that by then Lyon was champing at the bit, determined to get the job done at all costs. His telegram to General Merriam on May 9th betrays his mounting irritation. Quote, reliable information leads me to believe that there are at least 25 fugitives in hiding here. Secret raid executed at 2 this morning was frustrated by indifference or treachery of local officers. Sheriff has made no arrests and is out of town. Deputy Sheriff Violette flatly declined to make arrests but consented to accompany party. City Marshal Angevine wavered toward the last and declined to make arrests but consented to accompany the party. Mayor Webster advised Angevine not to make arrests or permit his men under circumstances. Local policemen declined to make an arrest when requested by my surgeon. U.S. Commissioner Smith seems a negative character. An effort is being made to release prisoners I hold on writ of habeas corpus, unquote. Obviously, it was time to get out. But could he really take with him the 10 men he held? Again, it seems that there was hesitation among Montana officials. But under heavy pressure from Idaho and federal authorities, Governor Robert Smith of Montana finally cabled Lyon on May 10th. The state of Montana will not interpose any objection to removing prisoners to Idaho without requisition papers. This is your authority. And on May 10th, Lyon and the 24th Infantry crossed over to Idaho with their 10 minor prisoners. For months, the debate over the Montana raid raged on. After extensive hearings by the House Committee on Military Affairs, The Republican majority endorsed this and other features of General Merriam's operation. But the Democratic minority thundered at Merriam's, quote, arbitrary, despotic, and tyrannical, unquote, behavior, with the Montana raid a central part of the indictment. Merriam, the Democrats charged, was guilty of a gross violation of law by sending Lyon and his troops into Montana. It cannot be contended for a moment, their report said, that General Merriam had any authority for this action. Honest men and women may differ on these facts. My own impression is that General Merriam and his subordinates were rough-hewn military men who had not thought through the implications of their action, stumbling along on an ad hoc basis, often under the burden of conflicting and politically motivated instructions from Washington. They often violated the rights of private citizens. On the basis of the evidence contained in War Department telegrams, the Montana raid appears to have been such an occasion. But it is in just such a matter that it is well to be suspicious of mere facts and to invoke Norman Mailer's shrewd admonition that they are nothing without their nuance, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony.